You ever have one of those moments where time just stops? Where your whole life, everything you thought you knew, just freezes mid-step, and you're left hanging there, heart pounding, stomach hollowed out, and you can't even breathe, right? That was me, standing in the garage, holding a plain white envelope with my name scribbled across the front. Henry. It wasn't a bill, not some junk mail, nothing official looking. It had been sitting on my workbench, half covered by an old pair of garden gloves and a roll of duct tape, like it had been there a while. I only noticed it because I was digging around for a socket wrench. Funny how life works. You're looking for one thing, and you end up finding something you wish you hadn't. I opened the envelope without thinking. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The kind you get from a lab, columns of data, rows of numbers, a name printed at the top. Tommy Johnson. My stomach tightened before my brain even caught up. I skimmed the page, words swimming, blurring, until I landed on the only section that mattered. Paternity analysis. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0%. I read it again, sure I must have misunderstood. Tommy Johnson, my son, was not my son. The world tipped sideways. There's this thing people say about getting hit with bad news. That it's like a punch to the gut. But that's not right. It's more like having the air ripped straight out of your lungs, like you're falling from some unimaginable height, and you don't know when you're going to hit the ground. I don't know how long I stood there, my fingers locked around that paper, my heart thudding so loud it was all I could hear. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't let go. My mind was screaming, there had to be a mistake, right? Some lab screw-up, some mix-up with the samples. But I couldn't shake the truth sitting there in black and white. My name was on the birth certificate, my name was on his backpack, on his soccer jersey. But not in his blood. The sound of the garage door creaking open snapped me out of it. Henry? Katie's voice floated in, light, warm, like nothing in the world had changed. Like my whole reality hadn't just been ripped apart. I shoved the envelope back under the gloves. My hands were still trembling, my heart slamming against my ribs. I couldn't face her. Not yet. Out here, I called back, voice rougher than I meant. She stepped in, all smiles and sunshine, her hair pulled back in that easy ponytail she always wore when she was running errands. I looked at her, this woman I'd loved for 15 years, the mother of my son, or so I believed. Dinner's almost ready, she said, like nothing was wrong. Like everything was fine. And for a split second, I almost believed it too. But that envelope was still there, tucked under the gloves, burning a hole in the back of my mind. I followed her inside, sat down at the table like I always did, smiled at Tommy when he told me about his day at school. My boy. My son. At least, that's what I told myself. I didn't eat much. My stomach was too twisted up, my mind too loud with questions I wasn't ready to ask. Where did the test come from? Who had ordered it? And the one I couldn't even say out loud, who the hell is Tommy's real father? That night, after Katie and Tommy went to bed, I sat alone in the dark living room, the envelope back in my hands, the weight of it heavy enough to crush my chest. I had no idea that this was only the beginning. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the sound of Katie's soft breathing beside me. I kept turning my head to look at her, this woman I thought I knew. Her face, so familiar, so safe. 15 years together. 15 years building this life, this home, this family. I could hear Tommy down the hall, shifting in his sleep. That little snore he's had since he was a toddler, the one that always made me smile. My kid. My little man. My shadow. But now, all I could think was, is he? Is he really mine? I don't know what time it was when I gave up on sleep and got out of bed. The house felt colder than usual. I ended up back in the garage, the paper spread out under the light, reading it again and again, hoping I'd miss something. Some loophole. Some explanation that would make this all go away. There wasn't one. I thought about waking Katie up right then and there, shaking her until she told me the truth. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. Because part of me still didn't want to know. Instead, I started wondering how this paper ended up in my garage. Katie wouldn't have left it there. She's careful, always tucking important things into her desk drawer or filing cabinet. This had been sitting out, where anyone could find it. Like someone wanted me to find it. I didn't like what that implied. Had someone sent it? Left it there on purpose? Who? And why now? I tried to think back. Had Katie been acting strange? Had there been signs I missed? Every relationship has bumps, arguments over bills, dumb fights about dishes or forgetting to take the trash out, but nothing that ever made me think she was hiding something this huge. And then there was Michael. Michael had been around for years, always hanging around our house, always laughing just a little too loud at Katie's jokes. I never thought much of it. He was married too, or at least he used to be. Nice enough guy, maybe a little slick for my taste, but nothing that ever raised any red flags. But now, every memory of him came back sharper. The way Katie's smile always seemed just a little brighter when he was around. The way his hand lingered just a second too long on her back when they hugged goodbye. The way Tommy had his dark hair, his lean build, nothing like me. No. I shook my head. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to start rewriting every memory, turning my whole life into some bad detective story. Except, that's exactly what it was starting to feel like. At some point, I ended up on the couch, staring at my wedding photo on the mantel. Me and Katie, so damn happy, so damn sure of each other. Tommy wasn't even a thought yet, just two kids who thought they had the whole world ahead of them. If someone had told me back then that 15 years later I'd be sitting in the dark wondering if my son was mine, I would have laughed in their face. But here I was. By morning, my mind was made up. I couldn't sit with this alone. I had to confront her. I had to know. I just wasn't ready for how much worse the truth was going to be. The sun was just starting to come up when I heard Katie moving around in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted down the hall, and for a split second, everything felt normal again. I almost let it go. Almost. But then I heard Tommy's footsteps pounding down the stairs, that burst of energy only a 10-year-old boy has first thing in the morning, and my stomach twisted all over again. I couldn't put it off any longer. I found Katie standing by the sink, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of my old t-shirts. She smiled when she saw me, like she always did. That smile used to feel like home. Now it felt like a mask. "Morning," she said, handing me a cup. "You're up early." I took the cup, but I didn't drink. My hands felt too unsteady. "Katie." My voice cracked on the first try. I cleared my throat and tried again. "I need to ask you something." Her smile slipped just a little, her brow pinching like she could already sense the shift in the air. "Okay." I pulled the paper from my pocket. I'd folded it and unfolded it so many times the edges were soft, the creases worn thin. I held it out. "What's this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She took it, her eyes flicking down, and I watched it happen. The exact second she realized what she was holding. The blood drained from her face. Her hand came up to her mouth, but not before I caught the slight tremble of her lip. Where did you find this?" she asked, voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. "Garage," I said. "Under some gloves. I need you to tell me what the hell is going on." Her shoulders slumped, like all the air had gone out of her. She didn't deny it. She didn't get angry. And that silence? That was worse than any screaming match we could have had. "Katie," I said again, and this time my voice broke for real. "Is Tommy mine?" Her eyes welled up. Tears hanging there, ready to fall, but she blinked them back. That hesitation, that pause, it was all the answer I needed. I felt the floor drop out from under me. "I can explain," she whispered. I stepped back, holding up my hands. "Explain? Explain what, Katie? Explain how you let me believe for 10 years that he was my son? Explain how you looked me in the eye every single day and never said a word?" She was crying now, shaking her head. "I never meant for this to happen. I laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. What does that even mean? She wiped at her face, her hands trembling. It was one mistake. One stupid, horrible mistake. Before I even knew I was pregnant. I didn't know for sure. I hoped. She couldn't finish the sentence. Who is it? I asked, my throat so tight I could barely get the words out. Who's his father? That hesitation again. That pause. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear her say it. It's Michael, she whispered. Michael. My friend. My goddamn friend. I felt something crack inside me, something deep and permanent, like the foundation of my entire life had just been yanked out from under me. There were so many things I wanted to say, wanted to scream, but all I could do was stand there, staring at this woman I thought I knew, this life I thought I had. And somewhere upstairs, Tommy was laughing at some dumb cartoon, blissfully unaware that his whole world was about to come crashing down. There's this strange thing that happens when someone drops a truth so big, so ugly, that your brain can't process it all at once. It's like you're underwater, sounds muffled, movements slow, like you're floating outside your own body, watching yourself react. I could see my hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white. I could feel my jaw clench until my teeth hurt. But it was like it was all happening to someone else. Someone whose life had just been ripped to shreds. Michael. The name echoed in my skull like a bell. Michael, the guy who came to our cookouts, who clinked beers with me on the back porch, who stood next to me at Tommy's birthday parties. The guy I shook hands with, laughed with, trusted. The guy who was Tommy's real father. How long? My voice sounded hollow, even to me. Katie's hands twisted together, fingers pulling at each other like they were trying to disappear into her skin. It wasn't an affair, she said, her voice shaking. It was just once. One night. We'd had a fight, you and me, and I was upset. Michael was there, and it just happened. I closed my eyes. One night. One night was all it took to rewrite my entire life. When did you know? I asked, my voice low and flat. I didn't, she said quickly, too quickly. Not for sure. Not until. Until what? Her eyes flicked down to the paper still sitting between us on the counter. I stared at her, trying to piece it together. You did the test? She nodded, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. A few months ago. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Tommy's getting older, and sometimes I see Michael in him. I had to know. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. So you knew? 4 months. And you just, what? Pretended everything was fine? Slept next to me every night knowing you were lying to me every second of every day. She flinched, and for a second, I felt guilty. Then I remembered, I wasn't the one who did this. I was scared, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose our family. Our family. I repeated the words like they were a foreign language. What even was our family anymore? Was I Tommy's dad, or was I just some idiot who raised another man's kid without even knowing it? My hands were shaking so bad I had to set my coffee cup down before I shattered it. Did Michael know? I asked. She didn't answer right away. That hesitation again. I was starting to hate that damn pause. Katie, I said louder this time. Did Michael know? She nodded, just once, her face crumpling. He suspected. I never told him for sure, but I think he knew. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed, every breath harder than the last. So he's been around Tommy all this time, I said, my voice trembling. Watching me raise his son, our son, and he never said a word? Katie tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled back like her touch would burn me. I'm so sorry, Henry, she whispered. I never wanted this. I couldn't look at her anymore. Not without seeing every lie, every secret, every betrayal written across her face. Somewhere behind me, I heard Tommy's laugh again, bright, innocent, untouched by any of this. I wanted to protect him from it, from all of it. But I didn't know how to protect a kid from the truth of his own life. I didn't storm out. That's what surprised me most. You'd think, after hearing something like that, I'd slam the door so hard the windows shook, maybe punch a hole in the drywall just to let some of it out. But I didn't. I just stood there. There's a different kind of rage, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't explode, it just sits in your chest, heavy and sharp, slicing you up from the inside out. That's where I was. Katie kept talking, but I don't remember much of what she said. Something about how it didn't mean anything, how it was always me she loved, how we could get through this if we just held on. Held on to what, exactly? She wanted me to believe that one night, just one night, was some tragic mistake. An accident. Like she'd tripped and fallen into his bed, or maybe the back seat of his car. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that it wasn't just a mistake. It was time. 10 years of time, and choices and lies. That's what people don't get about cheating. It's not just the sex. It's every time they look you in the eye after. Every time they tell you they love you. Every time they let you believe you're safe. And then there was Tommy. Every word Katie said after that just bounced off me. I wasn't even angry at her in that moment. I was just empty. Hollowed out. I walked past her, out into the yard, barefoot on the cold grass, because I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. The sky was still that pale early morning blue, the kind that always made me feel hopeful before. New day, fresh start. Not today. I heard the screen door creak open behind me. Katie didn't follow. She knew better than that, at least. I stood out there a long time, arms crossed, trying to pull myself together. Trying to remember who the hell I was before this, before I was some guy who needed a DNA test to tell him whether or not he was a father. I'd spent the last 10 years building a life around Tommy. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every dumb science project we stayed up late working on together, that was me. That was us. But now I didn't know where I stood. A father by blood? No. A father by love? Maybe. But what did that even mean, when the whole foundation had been a lie? Tommy didn't ask for any of this. He didn't choose who his parents were, and he sure as hell didn't deserve to be caught in the middle. But he would be. No matter what I did next. I couldn't hate him. That much was clear. No matter where he came from, he was still my boy, the kid who ran into my arms when I came home from work, the one who thought I hung the moon. But loving him didn't make the weight in my chest any lighter. The screen door creaked again, and this time it was Tommy, his messy hair sticking up in every direction, still in his Spider-Man pajamas. Dad? There was no hesitation in his voice. No doubt. Just Dad. Hey, buddy, I said, forcing my voice steady. What's up? He shrugged, rubbing his eyes. Mom said you were out here. You okay? How do you answer that? How do you tell a 10-year-old kid that the world he knows is about to break in half? I'm okay, I lied. Just needed some air. He nodded like that made perfect sense, then stepped up beside me, his small shoulder bumping against my side. Without thinking, I rested my hand on his head, ruffling his hair like I always did. And for a moment, I let myself believe that could be enough. The rest of that day passed in a haze, one of those stretches of time where everything feels too bright and too quiet at the same time. Katie moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes flicking to me every time I walked past, like she was waiting for me to either scream or collapse. I did neither. Tommy stayed oblivious, bouncing from cartoons to his video games, popping into the kitchen now and then to ask for snacks or show me something he built in Minecraft. Every time I looked at him, it was like a knife turning a little deeper. Not because I didn't love him, God, I loved that kid, but because I couldn't look at him without seeing the cracks spreading underneath our feet. And Michael. I couldn't get Michael out of my head. He'd been in our lives for so long, I couldn't even remember when we met. Some work event, maybe, Katie's +1 to some company party, back when Tommy was still in diapers. I remember thinking he was a little too charming, a little too smooth, The kind of guy who remembered everyone's name and told stories that made people laugh just a little too hard. But I never thought he was a threat. That's the thing, isn't it? You always think you'll see it coming, the crack in the wall, the change in the air. You think love comes with some kind of warning sign when it's about to fall apart. But there wasn't a warning. Not for me. I sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, the same table where we'd had birthday parties, Thanksgiving dinners, homework battles, and Katie stood across from me, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "Are you going to tell him?" I asked. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's just a kid, Henry. He doesn't need to know." "He's not just a kid," I said, my voice tight. "He's a kid with a right to know where he comes from. Whether or not his whole life is a lie." Her shoulders shook, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice so small I barely heard it. The question sat there between us, too big, too heavy. What was I going to do? Leave? Walk away from my whole life, from the boy who still called me Dad, from the woman I built this life with, even if every brick was now soaked in lies? Stay? Pretend none of this ever happened, bury it under chores and holidays and forced smiles, knowing every touch, every "I love you" came with an asterisk? Go after Michael? Find him, confront him, make him pay, for what, though? For being a man who made a mistake? For being the biological father of the boy I raised? Every option felt wrong. Every choice felt like losing. "I don't know," I said finally. And that was the truth. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what came next. The days after the truth came out felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Every corner of the house held a memory, every smile from Tommy was a gut punch, every glance from Katie was thick with unspoken words. I still went to work. I still came home. Dinner was still on the table. But everything underneath was wrong. The worst part was the silence. Katie and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was all surface-level stuff. Did Tommy turn in his homework? Did I remember to take the trash out? There was a whole goddamn landmine sitting between us, but neither of us was brave enough to step on it yet. It wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't just the lie. It was the time. 10 years. 10 years of bedtime stories and school projects and scraped knees. 10 years of believing I was watching my son, grow up. Every memory, every moment, felt infected now. Every time I remembered holding him, comforting him, teaching him, there was this sliver of doubt slicing through it. Was I a fool? Or was I still his father? Some nights, I stood in his doorway after he was asleep, just watching him breathe. He looked so peaceful, curled up with his old stuffed dinosaur, his hair sticking up in every direction. There wasn't a cell in that kid's body that came from me. But every bit of who he was, the way he smiled, the way he laughed at his own jokes, the way he always waited at the window when I came home from work, that was me. That was us. I told myself that over and over again. But it didn't stop the anger from building. And underneath the anger, there was something even uglier. Fear. Because no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I'd given to him, there was one truth I couldn't outrun. If Michael wanted to, if he decided he wanted to be part of Tommy's life, what the hell was stopping him? Biology was on his side. The courts loved DNA. I was just the guy who thought he was Tommy's dad. That thought haunted me, day and night. One evening, after Tommy went to bed, I found Katie sitting on the back porch. She was curled up under a blanket, staring at the dark yard, her eyes swollen from crying. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, torn between two instincts, comfort her or walk away. I didn't love her any less. That was the hardest part. After all this, after everything she'd done, my heart hadn't gotten the memo. It still reached for her. Still wanted to close that distance. But my mind? My mind was stuck replaying every touch, every kiss, every whispered secret between her and Michael. I stepped outside, sitting in the chair beside her, leaving just enough space between us to remind us both what had been broken. Have you talked to him? I asked, my voice quiet. She didn't look at me. No. Does he even know you did the test? She shook her head. I stared out at the yard, where Tommy's old soccer ball sat half buried in the grass. He's gonna find out eventually, I said. One way or another. Katie's voice was barely a whisper. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. Not then. Maybe not ever. All I knew was that the silence couldn't last much longer. Something had to break. The thing about secrets is they rot you from the inside out. You think you're holding them together with both hands, but the longer you try to keep them buried, the more they seep into everything. The way you talk, the way you touch, the way you even look at each other. That's what was happening to us. I'd wake up next to Katie and feel 100 miles away from her. Every time her phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. Every time she said, I love you. I wondered if she'd said the same thing to Michael once, with the same voice, the same smile. But the hardest part, the part that almost broke me, was pretending nothing had changed when I was with Tommy. He was still just a kid. My kid. My shadow. I still helped him with his homework, even though I could barely focus. I still drove him to soccer practice, plastering a smile on my face, cheering from the sidelines while my stomach churned. It wasn't his fault. I knew that. But knowing didn't make it easier. The first crack, the moment the silence finally started to split, came on a Sunday afternoon. Tommy and I were in the garage, cleaning out his old sports gear. The garage had always been our space, the place where we built birdhouses and fixed his bike, where I taught him how to change a tire and sand down a piece of wood until it was smooth as glass. We were halfway through sorting his soccer cleats when he stopped, holding up a pair he'd outgrown. Should we give these to Michael's kid? He asked, totally innocent. I bet they'd fit him. I froze. My hands clenched around the cardboard box I was holding, fingers digging into the edges. Michael's kid? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Yeah, Tommy said, shrugging. Michael said his son's starting soccer too. You didn't know? My vision blurred at the edges. Michael had a kid. I didn't even know Michael had a son, but Tommy did. How long had they been talking? How long had Michael been circling closer, stepping into the edges of my life without me even realizing it? Michael talked to you a lot? I asked, trying to sound casual. Tommy nodded. Sometimes. When he comes to visit Mom at work. That was it. The crack I'd been holding back finally split wide open. I put the box down, carefully, so carefully, and stood up. Be right back, buddy, I said, my voice just a little too tight. Keep sorting, okay? He nodded, humming to himself, oblivious to the storm rising inside me. I walked into the house, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, and found Katie in the kitchen. She was making sandwiches, knife scraping across the cutting board, her back to me. How often does Michael see Tommy? I asked. She froze. The knife stilled. Slowly, she turned around, her face pale. What? You heard me, I said. How often does Michael come around? How long has he been talking to my son? Katie set the knife down, pressing her palms flat against the counter. It's not what you think. That's the second time you've said that. I snapped. You want to tell me what it actually is, then? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the man you slept with, the man who fathered my son, has been hanging around, getting closer to him behind my back. Her eyes filled with tears. It's not like that. I never told Michael for sure. But I think he knows. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Of course he knows. And now he's just biding his time, isn't he? Waiting for the day Tommy finds out and starts wondering who his real dad is. Don't, Katie whispered, her voice shaking. Please, Henry. Don't say it like that. How the hell am I supposed to say it? I asked. You want me to pretend this is normal? That my best friend might decide one day that he wants to play daddy? She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. I didn't know how to stop it. You could have told me, I said. You could have told me the truth 10 years ago. But you didn't. And now? Now I don't even know what the hell I'm supposed to do with any of this. The silence after that was thick enough to choke on. I walked out of the kitchen, back into the garage where Tommy was still humming to himself, his small hands sorting through old cleats and deflated soccer balls. And all I could think was, what happens when the day comes that he knows the truth, too? That night, after Tommy was asleep and the house was quiet again, Katie and I sat in the living room. No TV. No distractions. Just us, and everything that had been simmering under the surface for days, for weeks, for years. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us had gotten comfortable in a way. Familiar, like an old wound that aches, but you've learned to live with it. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice low, almost apologetic. I can't pretend like none of this happened. Katie's hands were folded in her lap, fingers twisting nervously, the way they always did when she was scared. I know, she whispered. And I can't look at Tommy, at our son, and not wonder when the day's gonna come that Michael steps in and wants his piece of him. She shook her head. Michael doesn't. Don't. I cut her off, my voice sharper than I meant. Don't defend him. Not to me. She swallowed hard, nodding. I love that boy, I said. You understand that? I love him more than I know how to put into words. He's mine, even if he isn't. And that's never going to change. Katie looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed, hopeful for half a second. So we can. But I can't stay, I said, the words tearing out of me like a blade. I can't live in this house, in this lie, knowing you kept this from me for 10 years. I can't share a bed with you, can't pretend we're still the people we used to be. Her breath hitched, a quiet, broken sound. Please, Henry. I'm not walking away from Tommy, I said firmly. I'll always be his dad. No matter what. But you and me? We can't come back from this. Some things, they just break. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't argue. Maybe she knew. Maybe she'd known all along that this was the only way it could end. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't have anything left to say to that. The hardest part was telling Tommy. I sat him down the next afternoon, just the two of us in the backyard with a couple of sodas, the way we always did when we had man talks. He sat cross-legged on the grass, looking up at me with that trust only a kid can have, the kind that comes from believing your dad can fix anything. I couldn't fix this. Listen, buddy, I said, clearing my throat. Mom and we've been having a hard time lately. His face fell a little, but he nodded. You've been kinda quiet. Yeah, I said, trying to smile. We're gonna figure things out, but for a little while, I'm gonna be living somewhere else. The way his face crumpled almost broke me right there. Are you and Mom getting divorced? He asked, his voice small. I couldn't lie to him. Not after everything. Yeah, bud. We are. His eyes filled up, but he didn't cry. He just asked, Is it my fault? God, that question. It cut straight through me. No, I said, my voice firm. No, Tommy. This has nothing to do with you. Nothing you did, nothing you said. Mom and I just, sometimes grown-ups mess up. But we both love you. More than anything. Are you still my dad? I don't know if a 10-year-old knew how much weight those words carried, but they hit me like a hammer. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight. Always, I said. No matter where I live, no matter what happens, I'm your dad. I always will be. We sat like that for a long time, his small arms wrapped around me, his face pressed into my chest. He didn't need to know everything, not yet. Someday maybe. When he was older, when he was ready. But not today. Today, he just needed to know that I wasn't leaving him. Packing my bags that night felt like I was tearing out pieces of my own heart. Every corner of the house held some memory. The fort we built in the living room, the late-night kitchen dances with Katie, the scraped knees in the driveway. Katie stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, watching but not saying anything. We weren't enemies. We weren't screaming or slamming doors. That almost made it harder, knowing how much we'd lost without even a proper fight. At the door, I turned to her one last time. Take care of him. Her lip trembled. I will. I nodded, stepping outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe a motel. Maybe my brother's couch. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone. But somewhere, in the wreckage, was something still worth holding on to. Tommy. No DNA test could change that. It's been almost a year now. A year since I walked out of that house, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of questions I still don't have answers for. People always ask if time heals. I don't think it does, not really. Time just gives you space to get used to the weight you're carrying. You learn to move around it, to make room for it, to accept that some wounds never fully close. Katie and I don't talk much. We're civil, for Tommy's sake, but there's nothing left between us. No warmth, no bitterness, just emptiness. Sometimes I catch her looking at me when I drop Tommy off, like she wants to say something, but she never does. And I don't ask. Michael? I never confronted him. Not face to face. What would be the point? He knows I know. I'm sure Katie told him. And if he ever decides he wants to be part of Tommy's life, well, that's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. For now, all I care about is my son. I see Tommy every weekend, sometimes more. We go fishing, we build stupid projects in my garage, we play catch in the park until it's too dark to see. He's getting taller. His smile still knocks the wind out of me. And every time he calls me Dad, it reminds me, I might not have made him, but I sure as hell raised him. That's what being a father really is, isn't it? Not biology. Not blood. It's showing up. It's being there when they're scared, when they're hurt, when they need someone to hold the other end of the rope. That's what I tell myself, anyway. Most days I believe it. But every now and then, when Tommy asks where he gets his dark hair or his knack for soccer, there's a pause in my chest, a flicker of fear that one day, he's going to ask the question I can't answer without tearing open everything I've tried to rebuild. Maybe that day will come. Maybe it won't. All I can do is be here now. Show up. Love him. Be his dad. Because no matter how much the truth hurt, no matter how much it broke me, he's still my boy. And I'm still his father. That part, at least, no one can take away.